Last Sunday we began to see that events like Jesus calming the storm, that was our focus last Sunday. We began to see that events like those give us a kind of a window, in fact, quite a brilliant window into what heaven and hell will be like. And then in this morning's episode, we see exactly how Jesus can recycle sinful hearts and how he will judge God's enemies. And that's why our title for today is Recycled or the Rubbish Tip. That's our title for part 3 in this little series all about heaven and hell. This morning's true story that we just read from Mark chapter 5 is an amazing account of Jesus healing a demon-possessed man. And we're gonna walk through that episode together. We're gonna walk through these first 20 verses of Mark chapter 5. And what we see in the first 5 verses is that the man had no control. He had no control over his own life. Instead, his life was ruled by demons and in fact ruined by those demons. We see this especially in verses 3 and 4. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot. But he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. The powerful rule of these demons controlled every aspect of this man's life. Of all of the stories that we read in the Gospels, I think none of them reveals the devastating consequences of Satan's control over individuals. None of them does that better than this one. In the life of this man, we see the destructive forces of Satan at work. He is totally controlled by the demons within him. And notice that in verse 5, notice the terrible effects that this has on the man. Verse 5 says, "Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones." Out the mission of their master Satan, and that mission is to destroy completely the image of God in man. Hopefully you'll remember that way back in Genesis chapter 1, you'll remember that God made us, male and female, he made us in his image, in his own image. And well, that's why Satan hates us so very much and wants to destroy us. Satan vehemently wants to destroy God's image in us by destroying us. That's how bitter his hatred for God is. That he wants to destroy God's image wherever it can be found, including you and me. And here in this episode, in Mark chapter 5, the most visible effect of that is broken relationships. Broken relationships which result in complete isolation from all those around this man. He was completely alone. This was Satan's doing. Satan was at work through the control that these demons have over this man. Satan's work, it appears complete, absolute and complete, as this poor man must now roam the cemetery and the nearby hillside, lonely, angry and full of bitterness. Now at first glance this story seems so extreme. It seems so extreme that we might think to ourselves, well, what could this possibly have to do with me? But the truth is, if we look a little deeper, what we see in this man is actually a picture of every one of us. Whenever we look in the Bible, it's true that demon possession is a real thing. But in the Bible, it's actually not that common. But what is seen again and again, it's taught clearly and repeatedly in the New Testament, is Satan's power over unbelievers. We're told that our hearts and our behavior reflect our Father, whether that's Satan or God. So if our father is Satan, which is the condition that we're all born in, then our hearts and our lives will reflect that. But if our father is God, if we've come to the Lord Jesus Christ for forgiveness, then our lives will reflect the fact that we have become part of a different family, that we're now children of God. This man's total lack of self-control is reflected in his life in every way. And the same is true for us too. If we're still under the control of Satan, then that'll be reflected in some way in our lives too. If I was to ask you a question, if I was to ask you, do we have control over our sinful lives? I wonder how you would answer. Well, I think the answer is yes and no. We can be quite successful in reducing our sinful behaviour, but we cannot stop ourselves from being sinners. We're like the smoker who can reduce or can cut back, but can't quit. Even though he smokes only 1 cigarette a week, he's still a smoker. And in the same way, even if we try to sin less, we are still sinners. Just like the man here in Mark chapter 5, our sinful nature and our selfish hearts rule over us and affect our whole lives. When it comes to sin, without God's help, we are powerless against the consequences or against the constant sinful desires of our own hearts. We're out of control, just like the heading is for this first section of our message this morning. Next then, these demons in the man, they come face to face with Jesus, and our heading for this section really says it all. When these demons in this man come face to face with Jesus, there really is no contest. Here we're looking at verses 6 through to 13. What we see in these few verses is a stunning example of the complete power which Jesus has over the forces of evil. Whenever we read the words and examine the actions of the demons who control this poor man, we see a triumphant Jesus and a defeated devil. I wonder, did you notice that? Or did you notice the very first response that this demon has when it sees Jesus? Look at verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. When they see Jesus, these demons, their first response is instantly to fall on their knees. This is not an act of worship. Far from it. No, these demons despise Jesus and they hate bowing to him. But when they come face to face with the King of Kings, they have no option. That's what they must do. These demons, they clearly already knew about Jesus. In verses 7 and 8, which are up on the screen, in verses 7 and 8, the demons acknowledge 2 crucial facts. Firstly, who Jesus is, that he is the Son of the Most High God. That's the title these demons use whenever they cry out to Jesus. And secondly, they knew about Jesus' mission, which is to destroy the work of the evil one. Legion, that's the name they give whenever Jesus asks. Legion expects to be judged and punished. That's why he shouts, "Swear to God that you won't torture me." Now this story, it forces us to think about the day of judgment. On that day, the forces of evil will have no other option but to bow before God and to acknowledge that Jesus is God's all-powerful Son. On that day, the forces of evil will face torture and judgment. The next thing we notice is the reaction of the demons to the punishment which is about to be inflicted on them. Just look at the words used in verse 10. Words used to describe their predicament. They begged Jesus again and again, we're told. In verse 12 then, the demons begged Jesus for permission to go into some pigs. And in verse 13, Jesus gives them that permission. Think for a moment about this sight. Here we have Satan's workers, these demons, asking for Jesus' permission. Now, in the minds of many people today, if you speak about the battle between God and Satan, if you speak about that battle, people will think of two opposing forces with equal power. And well, I imagine that most people hope that God will win. But that's not the Bible's view. No, here we see Jesus, who is all-powerful, and a devil who is groveling on the floor, begging Jesus about the judgment he is about to face. It's so easy to start believing that God is powerless in this world. But this episode and so many others like it show us that it is God. It is God who is in control in this world. And Satan is no contest for him. Not by a long shot. And that takes us then to our third heading for this morning. And that third heading is no fear. Here we're looking at verses 15 to 20. Notice that the demons are gone, and now that they're gone, notice how different this man is. It's a complete turnaround. Look at verse 15. When they, which is the people from the nearby area, when they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind. The picture here at the end of this episode is nothing short of beautiful. The power of God has released this prisoner of Satan from the torment and from the misery he had endured. The man's condition has been 100% reversed. From nakedness, he is now dressed. And from having a mind filled with evil, he is now calm. And verse 18 tells us that the man wants to follow Jesus. He wants to follow Jesus, the one who rescued him. What this clearly displays to us is the difference that Jesus makes in the life of a believer. The mission of Jesus is to gather a people of his very own, a people who he will transform to make more and more and more like him. On that last day of history when Jesus returns, we're told that he will destroy all evil and all sin. And this story shows us what to expect, and it guarantees us that it will happen. That takes us then to our fourth and final heading for today, which is no doubt possible. Now, for this, we need to look back at the response of those local people in verses 14 through to 18. You see, often lurking in people's minds is the thought that on the day of judgment it won't really be as bad for unbelievers as the Bible makes out. But this episode puts an end to all such doubts. And that's why it has the heading, No Doubt Possible. You see, we've clearly seen how Jesus is going to judge Satan, but we also get a foretaste of how Jesus will treat those who have refused to follow him. Look at verse 17 for a moment. What do you think of the reaction of these local people in verse 17? It says, "Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region." See, this episode finishes not with hordes of people following Jesus and thanking him for changing the life of this demon-possessed man. No, it's quite the opposite. It's the complete opposite. What we read is that these people who have seen with their very eyes the power of God changing a demon-possessed man, Instead of begging to follow Jesus, they beg him to leave. They plead with Jesus to leave their area. And Jesus' response is totally devastating, because that's what he does. He gives these people exactly what they asked for, and he leaves them. Now, in many ways, the day of judgment will be exactly the same as this scene. Jesus will give unbelievers exactly what they have chosen for themselves, which is life without God's blessing. So let's not be in any doubt, because the Bible leaves us no room for doubt. If in this life you reject Jesus, in the next life he will reject you. Now, that's not a pleasant thought, and it pains me to say it, but it's true. So I urge you, don't reject Jesus. Instead, run to him and be rescued out of Satan's grip and be welcomed into God's kingdom. I pray that if you haven't done that already, I pray that you will. And if you have already taken that step, if you are a follower of Jesus, then I urge each and every one of us to warn the people that we share our lives with, those who are still under Satan's control. Warn them and urge them to run to Jesus, to be welcomed into his family. Just now we're going to pray, so let's bow.